R has a bunch of built-in functions that we can make use of. For example, if we wanted to calculate the mean, the average of a string of numbers, we can use the mean function, which exists in R. That's part of what's called base R, the basic set of functions that R contains. And here I can take the mean function, and if I feed it vec1, which is that string of 6 numbers that we had, it will return the mean value of that object, the mean value of that series of numbers. You can do the same thing with median, right? You can do range is another one. Standard deviation is another one. You can take the logarithm of these values, and this is an interesting function because taking the logarithm in this sense is applying the log to each of the 6 values in vec1, so you get 6 values returned when you run this function. Of course, you need to keep in mind what objects you're plugging in here. If I were to run the log of vec2, I would get an error, right? Because vec2 is just an object that contains these words. And so you can't take the logarithm of a word, which is why R won't let you, and it gives you an error message. And of course, if you run into an error like this and you're not quite sure, right, this error message, of course, isn't that helpful. Error in log vec2, non-numeric argument to mathematical function. You might be able to puzzle out what that means, and using this str function, remember the structure function, should allow you to kind of unpack what's going on. If you run structure on vec2, you'll see that it's a character vector. That's why it won't run that function. So this can help you troubleshoot a little bit. Now, when you're playing with these functions and using them, sometimes they're complicated, right? The ones that we just ran aren't all that complicated, but for example, the log function is actually a little bit complicated. There's different types of logarithms, for example. Is it a base E? Is it a base 10 logarithm, if you remember that from math class? And if you want to know what it's doing behind the scenes, you can use the question mark function, which is really kind of the help function in R. If I were to type question mark log and run that, now here in the bottom right panel of RStudio, the help tab has popped up, and I've opened the help file for this page on logarithms and exponentials, which explains the log function and also the exp function. But here I can see an example of how to use the log function, what I need to plug in. You can read a little bit about it here. There's a description, right? The default is a natural logarithm, in case you were wondering. The usage here, which I have highlighted, is how to make use of the function. The arguments, this is what it takes. This is what the function takes. So typing log of vec.1, just like this, and running it and taking the log of those 6 values, essentially what I'm doing is saying that this x argument here in the help file, right, which is what you need to feed the function, that is equal to vec1. If I were to run this, I get the same output. R understands that you don't always need to specify the argument that you're plugging in. Sometimes you can just type it, as long as you type it in order, right? If I wanted to do another argument in here, for example, there's the base argument, and I wanted to specify a different base value, I would need to do comma, base equals, and then put in whatever you want the base to be, right? If you run this, it's the same thing. I couldn't, for example, put this first unless I specified what argument it's taking. So if I were to copy this bit, the base equals, and if I put that in front, and I put the x equals argument next, I'll still get the same value because I'm specifying the exp of 1, the exponent of 1 is the base, and vec1 is the actual kind of value that I'm feeding it. But if I were to delete these argument names and just run the log of exp1 comma vec1, that is not going to return the same output. R is getting very confused as to what I'm telling it here because I've now kind of ruined the order that it's feeding things into this function. It thinks that the exponent of 1 is what I want to take the log of, and it thinks that my base value is vec.1, which doesn't make any sense. So you need to be careful when you're using functions to make sure that you get the order right. And if you don't know the order, you can look it up in the help file. And if you want to be really careful, just specify each argument and what it equals. Continuing along in the help file, you'll see that there's details here that go into a bit more depth on what the function is doing. Some extra information, the source where you can find more information here, the reference for this, who wrote this function. And then at the bottom is probably the most important part, where you can see examples of how to use this function. What would happen if you type log the exponent of 3, using a variant of the log function, which is the log10 function, feeding it a number. So anytime you're unsure of how to use a function, type question mark the function name, pull up the help page, and scroll down to the bottom and look at examples of how to do it. That's the most important thing. Now, of course, there are a lot of built-in functions in R, but you are also able to write your own functions. And this is not something that we're really going to be doing much in this module, but I do want to show you that it is possible to create your own function. So for example, if I wanted to make a function, here I'm calling it do math, and I use the assignment operator. This means that I'm creating an object called do math that's going to contain my function. If you want to write your own function, you use this function, and then open parentheses and put an x. X is then the argument that the function is taking. I then put squiggly brackets, and inside the squiggly brackets, I can say, all right, take 7 times x and then divide that by 23.6. Just an absurd example of what a function might do. So in this case, what this function is doing is saying, take a value that you plug in, which will be x, multiply it by 7, divide it by 23.6. If I run this code, now up in the environment, there's a functions section where the function do math is listed. If I then, back in my R script, type do math, I open parentheses, and I plug in the number 3.4. And if I run that, it then spits out the value that is the result of this mathematical operation. What it did was take 3.4 and plug it in place of x in this function. So it took 7 times 3.4 and then divided that by 23.6 and spit out the result of that down here. A really important thing that's also good to know about is that if you have a function and you want to assign that to an output, I can create an object to hold that function output, use the assignment operator with the function there, and if I run this, now it doesn't spit out the value of 1.008, it assigned it to a new object. And if I look at that object, function.output, that now contains the output from my function. You can do this also with any other function, right? The mean of vec1 before. Instead of just spitting out the mean value of vec1, it assigned it to this function.output object. 3.5 is now contained within that object. So this is really important as well, to know how to assign the output of functions to objects, and to know that you could write your own function. And even if you never end up writing your own function, this is kind of how functions work. There's some operation going on within the function, and the argument that you're feeding it is being plugged into that and run, and you can then take that output and do with it as you will.